The great observatory of the Ethel-Guardian hegemony was a place of silence, a vast, domed chamber of obsidian and crystallized starlight that sat perched upon the highest peak of a dying world. Yet on this day, the silence was not one of peace, but of a suffocating, pressurized dread that weighed upon the souls of the 300 representatives gathered within. The heavy, pressurized atmosphere of the chamber, usually smelling of ozone and ritual incense, was today thick with the pheromones of fear, a chemical cocktail of distress signals emitted by a dozen different species that had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. Above them, the holographic dome, a masterpiece of ancient photon-weaving technology, displayed the galaxy not as a swirling, majestic spiral of light and potential, but as a dying organism, its outer limbs turning a necrotic gray as the data stream updated in real time, showing the encroaching darkness that had consumed sector after sector, star system after star system, leaving nothing but dead worlds and dust in its wake. They called it the nullity, a force of entropy made manifest, a tidal wave of negation that did not conquer, did not negotiate, and did not pause. It simply erased, turning complex civilizations into background radiation, and now it was here, pressing against the borders of the inner rim, the sanctuary of the elder races. High Counselor Vrax, a being of chitin and grace, his carapace polished to a shimmering iridescent sheen that denoted his status as the voice of the Synod, stood at the center of the dais, his four grasping manacles resting heavily on the podium as he looked out at the assembly, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the terror of the galaxy. For he knew, as they all knew, that the time for debate had ended cycles ago, and now there was only the cold, hard logic of survival. The debate had raged for 3 solar days, a futile exercise in rhetoric where the representatives of the Kryllian Star Empire argued for a fortification of the nebula passes, while the fluid-brained matriarchs of the Uli insisted on trying to communicate with the darkness. But all such talk had withered away as the sensor ghosts turned into confirmed kills, huge swaths of the frontier fleet vanishing in milliseconds. Vrax let out a low, chittering sigh, a sound that vibrated through his thorax, and activated the omnicaster, his voice booming through the chamber, translated instantly into the native tongues of the assembled delegates, carrying the weight of a death sentence for their way of life. He declared that the time for standing was over, that the simulations, run by the greatest artificial intelligences the galaxy had ever constructed, the quantum minds of the core, had all returned the same verdict with a probability of error so infinitesimally small it was indistinguishable from zero. To fight was to die, to stand was to be erased, and the only path that ensured the continuity of their genetic lines, the preservation of their histories, and the survival of their civilizations was the Great Exodus. The silence that followed his proclamation was absolute, a heavy blanket of resignation as the realization settled in that they were to become refugees in their own universe, that the great fleets of gold and silver, the dreadnoughts that had policed the stars for millennia, were not to be used as swords, but as lifeboats carrying the seeds of the elder races into the dark void between galaxies, running from the burning house of the Milky Way before the roof collapsed entirely. Yet amidst this grim acceptance, there was a ripple of confusion, a discordant note in the symphony of despair, appearing as a blinking amber anomaly on the strategic map that hovered above Vrax's head. A stubborn, unmoving marker located in the sector of Sol, a backwater region inhabited by the youngest, most volatile, and least understood members of the Council. The humans, a species that had barely achieved faster-than-light travel 2 centuries prior, a blink of an eye in the grand scope of galactic history, were not moving. Their transponder signals were not vectoring towards the galactic rim, nor were they powering down their infrastructure to hide in the noise of the stellar background. But rather, they were burning bright, their energy output spiking to levels that defied the standard classifications of their technological tier. A murmur ran through the assembly, a sound like dry leaves skittering over stone, as the representative of the Xylot Dominion, a towering reptilian warlord named Kravax, slammed a fist onto his console, demanding to know why the Terran Union had not acknowledged the evacuation protocols, why their fleets remained in high anchor around their blue-green cradle world and its colonies, and if their primitive translators had malfunctioned, failing to convey the absolute certainty of the doom approaching them. Vrax tapped a command into the podium, isolating the Sol sector on. The main display, zooming in past the Uit clouds and the gas giants, past the asteroid belts that the humans mined with such voracious industrial appetite, to reveal a formation of ships that made no sense to the tactical algorithms of the elder races. Ships that were blocky, utilitarian, devoid of the elegant curves and energy-efficient designs of the Synod. Ships that bristled with kinetic weaponry, mass drivers, and nuclear silos. Weapons considered barbaric and obsolete by the civilized galaxy. They were not packing, they were digging in. The audacity of it was so profound that for a moment, the fear of the nullity was replaced by a collective bewilderment, a sense that the humans had simply lost their minds, succumbing to a collective madness induced by the scale of the threat. For surely no rational species, no civilization capable of mathematics and logic, would choose to stand in the path of a storm that had already extinguished the light of 1,000 suns. Vrax signaled the communications officer, a slender avian creature whose feathers were ruffled in distress, ordering a direct channel to be opened to the Terran High Command, bypassing the diplomatic niceties and the layers of bureaucracy, for there was no time for protocol when the executioner's axe was already falling. The screen flickered, the static of high-band interference washing over the image before it stabilized, revealing not a council of panicked politicians or a screaming mob, but a dimly lit bridge, utilitarian and cramped, filled with the hum of machinery and the quiet, clipped tones of operators reading sensor data. In the center of the frame sat a human, an older male with hair the color of steel wool and eyes that looked like chipped flint, wearing a uniform of dark blue that bore no ceremonial medals, no sashes of office, only the simple gold bars of rank upon his shoulders. He sat with a stillness that was unnerving, his hands resting on the armrests of his command chair, his gaze fixed not on the camera, but on a tactical display just out of view. "This is High Counselor Vrax of the Ethel Guardian Hegemony, speaking for the Grand Synod," Vrax intoned, his voice projected into the human bridge, expecting the human to jump to show deference, or at least to show the panic that should be consuming his species. "We are monitoring your energy signatures, Admiral. You are not vectoring for the rendezvous coordinates. The nullity will breach the Perseus arm in less than 40 standard cycles. If you do not initiate the Exodus protocols immediately, the Terran Union will be cut off. You will be consumed. Do you not understand the data we sent you? The survival probability of static defense is 0. The human admiral, whom the data files identified as Fleet Admiral Aurelius Thorne, slowly turned his head, his eyes locking onto the pickup sensor with a terrifying calm, a lack of emotion that Vrax found more disturbing than the hysteria of the Uli matriarchs. Thorne did not shout, did not plead, did not argue. He simply leaned forward slightly, the harsh lighting of the bridge casting deep shadows across his face, emphasizing the scars of old conflicts that the elder races had deemed petty tribal squabbles. "We received your data, Counselor," Thorne said, his voice a low rumble devoid of the tremulous pitch of fear. "We analyzed your simulations. We saw the math. You calculated that the only way to save the species is to run, to scatter into the dark and hope the storm passes, or that we can find a new rock to cling to in another galaxy." "It is the only logical conclusion," Vrax insisted, his mandibles clicking in agitation. "The nullity adapts, it absorbs energy, it breaks down matter. Every fleet sent against it has fueled its advance. To fight is to feed it. You are committing species-wide suicide. For the sake of the diversity of the galactic community, I order you to launch your colony ships. We will provide escort for your stragglers." Thorne paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, not a smile of humor, but of a grim iron resolve that the alien mind found difficult to parse. "That is where we differ, Counselor," the human said softly. "You see the galaxy as a house to be fled when it catches fire. We see it as our home, and humans, we don't run from our homes. We have evacuated the civilians, yes. The colony ships are gone, heading for the vector you provided, silent and running dark. But the fleets. The fleets stay. For what purpose?" Kravax roared from the background, his reptilian aggression breaking through the diplomatic channel. "To die, to be a speed bump that slows the nullity by a microsecond. Your technology is primitive. Your shields are kinetic barriers and unstable plasma. You cannot stop the tide." "We don't intend to stop the tide with just ships," Thorne replied, his gaze shifting to Kravax with a sharpness that made the warlord flinch. "And you are right. By your logic, we are already dead, but your logic is flawed because it assumes the variables are static. You assume the enemy is a force of nature. We assume it is an enemy, and enemies can be killed. We are not staying to die, Counselor. We are staying to hold the line. Because if everyone runs, who is left to ensure there is a galaxy to come back to?" The transmission cut before Vrax could respond. leaving the council in a stunned silence that was heavier than before, the image of the human admiral's resolute face burning into their minds, a testament to a species that was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. The reaction in the chamber was immediate and chaotic, a cacophony of voices condemning the arrogance of the primates, analyzing their psychological profiles, and declaring them lost, a tragedy of evolution that had produced a creature too stubborn to live. Yet as the Grand Synod resumed its frantic preparations for departure, as the great engines of the world ships began to spin up, shaking the very tectonic plates of the capital world, Vrax could not shake the feeling that he had missed something, a variable that the quantum minds had not accounted for, something hidden in the way the human had spoken, the specific cadence of his words. Enemies can be killed. Days turned into weeks, the countdown to the nullity's arrival ticking away with agonizing precision, and the galaxy watched, or at least the sensors of the fleeing fleets watched, as the Terran Union dug its heels into the fabric of spacetime around the Sol system. The elder races, in their retreat, observed the humans deploying megastructures that had been built in secret, vast lattices of tritanium and resonating crystals towed out of the asteroid belts and assembled in the void between Mars and Jupiter. They watched as the humans detonated their own outer colonies, not out of madness, but to create debris fields, shaping the battlefield, funneling the approach vectors into a narrow corridor that pointed directly at the heart of their system. It was a strategy of attrition, a killing box on a stellar scale, but against an enemy that consumed matter, it seemed like feeding the fire. The nullity arrived not with a bang, but with a silence that was deafening to the psychic sensitives of the fleet. The stars simply went out, one by one, as the event horizon of the entropy wave washed over them, stripping the electrons from atoms, turning matter into a soup of gray uselessness. It rolled over the Alpha Centauri system, which the humans had abandoned, and the sensors showed the wave accelerating, drawn in by the mass of the Sol system, reacting to the bait the humans had laid out. On the bridge of the flagship Iron Will, Admiral Thorne watched the main view screen, which showed the wall of nothingness approaching, a black curtain drawn across the starfield, eating the light of the universe. The bridge was silent, the crew strapped into their crash couches, the air recyclers humming loudly in the tension. Beside him stood Ambassador Kale, a representative of the Ethel Guardians who had refused to evacuate, a scholar who claimed he wanted to document the end of a species, though Thorne suspected the aliens simply couldn't bear the shame of running. Kale was trembling, his chitin rattling softly against his envirosuit, his eyes wide with the terror of a creature facing its biological end. "It is here," Kale whispered, his voice trembling. "The end of history." "Admiral, there is still time for a single warp jump. The scout pinnace is prepped. We can save the command staff." Thorne didn't look at him. "Engineering, status on the Aegis array." "Capacitors are at 110%, Admiral," came the voice of the chief engineer, tense but controlled. "The grid is singing. We are redlining the reactors on Titan and Ganymede. If we hold this charge any longer, the moons will crack." "Hold it," Thorne ordered, his voice like granite. "Wait until you see the whites of their eyes, or whatever the hell this thing has." The nullity hit the Uit cloud, and for the first time the enemy reacted. The cloud was not just ice and dust, but seeded with millions of fusion mines, archaic weapons that the humans had mass-produced by the billion. The silent explosion was not visible as fire, but as a ripple in the darkness, the entropy wave stuttering as it digested the sudden influx of chaotic energy. It was a pinprick, a mosquito bite on a leviathan, but it forced the wave to slow, to consolidate its form, condensing from a nebulous cloud into a spearhead focused on the source of the resistance. This was what Thorne had waited for. The enemy was predictable in its hunger. It sought the path of least resistance, or the source of the greatest energy to consume. By showing it a feast, he had made it solid. "Now," Thorne whispered, "activate the Aegis, fire the graves." The tactic that followed was not one of superior firepower, for the humans had none compared to the elder races, but of superior physics, a manipulation of the fundamental forces that the other races treated with superstitious reverence. From the moons of Jupiter, from the orbital rings of Earth, and from the surface of Mars, massive beams of coherent gravitons, generated by the energetic disassembly of entire captive asteroids, fired not at the enemy, but at a singular point in space directly in front of the nullity's advance. At the same time, the fleet, thousands of ships ranging from dreadnoughts to converted freighters, unleashed a volley of relativistic kinetic penetrators. Solid tungsten slugs accelerated to 90% of light speed. The slugs did not hit the enemy. They hit the gravity well the humans had just created. The result was a tear in the fabric of reality, a localized singularity that was violent, unstable, and terrifyingly bright. The nullity, rushing forward to consume the energy, slammed into the gravity shear. For a moment, the laws of physics screamed. The entropy wave, which relied on the smooth unraveling of atomic bonds, was suddenly subjected to the crushing tidal forces of a man-made black hole. The darkness buckled. It didn't just stop, it shattered. The coherent wave broke into fragmented tendrils, confused and disoriented, its hive mind. If it had won, stunned by the sheer brute force of the trap. "Target the fragments," Thorne roared, standing up from his chair. "All batteries, free fire, burn them out." The human fleet, which the aliens had mocked for its primitive reliance on projectile weaponry and nuclear fire, unleashed hell. The fragmentation of the nullity rendered it vulnerable to conventional energy. The void stuff, once broken from the main wave, could be burned. Nuclear warheads, dirty and radioactive, detonated in the thousands, creating a wall of plasma fire that seared the darkness. The human ships took losses, heavy losses, as tendrils of the nullity whipped out, dissolving hulls and turning crews to dust in an instant. The iron will shook violently as a glancing blow sheared off its port sensor array, alarms screaming through the bridge, sparks showering down from the overhead conduits. But they didn't run. They advanced. "Forward," Thorne commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Drive them back into the singularity, close the net." In the deep void, the fleeing fleets of the elder races paused. Their long-range sensors, trained aft in a vigil of shame, picked up the impossible. The red tide of the nullity was not advancing. It was churning, boiling, and impossibly retreating. The signals from Sol were chaotic, filled with the electromagnetic screams of dying ships and the roar of nuclear fire, but the line on the map held. Vrax, watching from the bridge of the Ethel Guardian super-dreadnought Star of Dawn, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold of space. He watched the telemetry, the impossible energy spikes, the sheer ferocity of the human defense. They were using their own solar system as a weapon, burning their own resources, sacrificing their own ships not to escape, but to kill. "They are winning," Kravax whispered, his reptilian arrogance replaced by a stunned awe. "How? The simulations, the math." "The math assumed we valued survival above all else," Vrax murmured, realization dawning on him. "It assumed we would minimize loss, the humans. They are maximizing cost. They are spending their lives like currency to purchase time. They are not fighting for survival. They are fighting for victory." The battle for Sol lasted 3 days. 3 days of continuous combat, where the humans threw everything they had into the grinder. They rammed ships into the larger fragments of the nullity, detonating their reactor cores on contact. They overloaded the planetary shields of Mars to create an EMP burst that fried the neural pathways of the void constructs. It was a brawl, a dirty, desperate knife fight in the dark, devoid of the elegance of naval combat the elder races prized. It was brutal, industrial slaughter. And on the 4th day, the silence returned. But it was not the silence of the grave. It was the silence of exhaustion. The nullity, broken, battered, and starved of the momentum it needed to sustain its existence, had dissipated, its cohesion shattered by the gravitational anomalies and the nuclear firestorm. The remnants of the wave drifted harmlessly away, evaporating into background radiation. The Sol system was a ruin. The orbital rings were shattered, the moons of Jupiter were cracked, and the debris field around Earth was a thick belt of metal and frozen atmosphere. But the sun still shone. The planets still spun. And the human fleet, reduced to 40% of its strength, scarred and broken, still stood guard. The return of the elder races was hesitant, filled with a mixture of relief and profound shame. The great fleets dropped out of warp at the edge of the Sol system, their golden hulls pristine and untouched, contrasting sharply with the BL. Akin, twisted wreckage of the human defense line. A shuttle from the Star of Dawn carried High Counselor Vrax and the other leaders to the Iron Will, which was venting atmosphere and leaking coolant, listing heavily in orbit around Earth. They were met in the hangar bay not by a pristine honor guard, but by tired men and women in scorched combat armor, some nursing injuries, others sitting on crates cleaning their weapons. There was no pomp, no ceremony. Admiral Thorne stood waiting for them, his uniform torn, his left arm in a sling, his face gray with fatigue. Vrax stepped forward, his head bowed low, a gesture of submission he had never performed in 400 years of life. "Admiral Thorn," he began, his voice humble. We have no words. The galaxy owes you a debt that can never be repaid. You did the impossible. You stopped the nullity." Thorn looked at him, his eyes heavy. "We didn't do it for you," he said raspingly. "And we didn't do it because we're brave. We did it because we had to." "But why?" asked the Uli matriarch, stepping forward, her fluid form rippling with confusion. "Why sacrifice so much? Why not run? You could have rebuilt elsewhere." Thorn sighed, gesturing for them to follow him. He led them not to the bridge, but deeper into the ship, down through the secure levels, past checkpoints manned by soldiers who looked at the aliens with cold, hard eyes. They reached a high-security vault, a chamber shielded by layers of density-collapsed alloy. Thorn placed his hand on the scanner, and the heavy doors hissed open. Inside, there was a single pedestal, and on it, a device that hummed with a resonance that made Vrax's carapace itch. It was ancient, far more ancient than the humans, far more ancient even than the Ethel Guardians. It was a shard of crystalline light, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the universe. "We found this on Mars 50 years ago," Thorn said quietly. "We didn't understand it at first, but when your nullity started eating stars, this thing started singing. It's not a weapon, it's a key." "A key to what?" Vrax asked, stepping closer, feeling the immense power radiating from the object. "To the cage," Thorn replied. "The nullity wasn't an invader, counselor. It was a jailbreak. It was trying to get in, not out. It was trying to get to this." The aliens stared in horror. "You mean you were guarding something?" "We realized that the Sol system is a lock," Thorn explained. "And humanity, we're the keepers. The nullity is an ancient biological weapon, a cleanup crew designed to wipe the slate clean if the lock is ever threatened. If we had run, if we had left the system, the lock would have opened. The nullity would have consumed the mechanism, and whatever is behind the door would have been released." "What is behind the door?" Kravex asked, his voice barely a whisper. Thorn looked at the crystal, then back at the gathered leaders of the galaxy. "We don't know for sure, but the archives we decoded call it the hunger that dreams. A cosmic predator that makes the nullity look like a microbe. The nullity was trying to destroy the lock to prevent the sleeper from waking up, or maybe to feed it. We don't know. All we knew was that if we ran, the lock breaks. If the lock breaks, everything ends. Not just us, not just you. Reality." The revelation struck the council like a physical blow. The humans hadn't just fought a war. They had stood between the universe and total unmaking. They had endured the assault of the antibody to protect the body of the cosmos. "You knew," Vrax whispered. "You knew that staying meant almost certain death, and you stayed anyway to protect a galaxy that looked down on you." "We're stubborn," Thorn shrugged, a hint of the old human arrogance returning. "And we don't like being told where we can and can't live. Besides," he looked at the screen on the wall, showing the battered remains of his fleet, and beyond them the blue marble of Earth, scarred but still turning. "We figured if we survived this, we'd have a hell of a bargaining chip at the next council meeting." The silence in the room stretched, but this time it was not the silence of fear, nor the silence of the void. It was the silence of respect, absolute and profound. The elder races looked at the humans, these short-lived, violent, illogical creatures, and realized they were looking at the new masters of the galaxy. Not masters by conquest, but masters by right of guardianship. "The council is dissolved," Vrax said suddenly, his voice ringing with authority. "The Ethel Guardian hegemony hereby pledges its fleet to the reconstruction of the Sol system. We will stand with you, Admiral. We will help you hold the lock." "As will the Xylot," Kravex grunted, crossing his arms. "You fight well for soft skins." One by one, the representatives pledged their support, their resources, and their loyalty. The hierarchy of 10,000 years had been overturned in THR. Days of fire. The species that ran had returned to find that the species that stood had changed the rules of the game. Thorn nodded, accepting the pledges with a tired nod. "Good," he said, "because according to the readings on the artifact, the nullity was just the vanguard, and now that we've broken the immune system, the real threat might start stirring. We're going to need a lot more guns." He turned back to the crystal, the light of it reflecting in his eyes, eyes that had seen the end of the world and refused to blink. The humans had stood their ground, and in doing so, they had not just saved the galaxy, they had inherited it. And as the fleets of the galaxy moved into formation around the wounded Sol system, forming a new wall of steel and light, the universe held its breath, waiting to see what the humans would do next. For the first time in eons, the future was not a calculated probability, but a wild, dangerous, and glorious unknown. The diplomatic aftermath was as complex as the war itself, a shifting landscape of power dynamics that left the ancient bureaucrats of the core world scrambling to adjust. The Terran Union, previously a minor trade partner with a reputation for aggressive colonization and uncouth diplomatic manners, now sat at the head of the table. Not literally, for the humans refused to move the seat of governance to the prime spire on Ethelgard, insisting instead that the new Galactic Defense Pact be headquartered on the moon of Titan, overlooking the wreckage of the battle that had forged the alliance. This decision forced the highborn dignitaries of the galaxy to travel to the grim, industrial habitats of the human frontier, to breathe recycled air that smelled of ozone and engine grease, and to walk corridors that were built for function, not beauty. It was a subtle power play, a reminder of who held the keys to the cage, and it worked. Ambassador Kale, who had remained on the Iron Will throughout the conflict, became the primary liaison between the Synod and the Terran Command. He found himself in a unique position, acting as a translator not just of language but of philosophy. He spent long cycles in the mess halls of the human ships, listening to the soldiers, Marines, they called themselves, tell stories of the battle. He was baffled by their psychology. They did not speak of the war with the solemn reverence of the Ethelgardians, nor the bloodlusting pride of the Xylot. They spoke of it with a dark, abrasive humor, making jokes about how close they had come to death, giving nicknames to the horrifying tendrils of the nullity. They complained about the food, the lack of sleep, the pay, yet Kale observed that not a single one of them would have traded their place on the line for safety. It was a paradox that Kale chronicled in his journals, which would later become bestsellers across the galaxy, the logic of madness, a study of the human spirit. They value the collective abstract, humanity, freedom, the future more than the individual concrete survival, Kale wrote. Whereas we evolved to preserve the carrier of the genes, they evolved to preserve the idea of the tribe. They are dangerous because they can convince themselves that dying is a winning strategy. This danger was not lost on the political establishment. In the months following the victory at Saul, tensions began to simmer. The immediate threat of the nullity was gone, and gratitude, as is the way of politics, has a short half-life. Factions within the Synod began to whisper that the humans were holding the galaxy hostage, that the lock on Mars was a fabrication, or worse, a weapon that the humans intended to use to subjugate the elder races. The Kryllian Star Empire, in particular, was vocal in its distrust, their emperor demanding that a multi-species science team be given full access to the artifact to verify Thorne's claims. Thorne, now promoted to the rank of Grand Admiral of the Combined Defense Forces, received these demands with the same stony silence he had shown Vrax. He knew that allowing the Kryllian scientists, who were known for their reckless experimentation, access to the artifact was a recipe for disaster. But he also knew that the alliance was fragile. If he refused outright, he risked a civil war just as the galaxy was rebuilding. "They want to poke the sleeping bear," Thorne muttered to his aide, a sharp-eyed woman named Commander Alina Vance, as they reviewed the diplomatic communique in his office on Titan. "They think it's a battery they can plug into their hyperdrives." "They're afraid, Admiral," Vance replied, pouring 2 cups of synthetic coffee. "They ran, we stayed. Every time they look at us, they see their own cowardice. They need to bring us down to their level to feel safe again." "If they poke that artifact, they won't have time to feel safe," Thorne grumbled, rubbing his temples. "We need to show them, not the artifact. We need to show them what happens when you S with the fundamental constants." Thorne orchestrated a demonstration. He invited the Kryllian Emperor and the Doubters to a research station on the edge of the system, where human scientists had managed to isolate a microscopic fragment of the nullity's energy, trapped in a stasis field. He gathered the dignitaries in an observation deck, shielded by 3 meters of blast glass. "You believe we are exaggerating the threat," Thorne addressed the assembly, his voice amplified through the room. "You believe the lock is a political tool. Watch." He gave the signal. The scientists lowered the containment field by 0.01%. The reaction was instantaneous. The speck of nullity matter, no larger than a grain of sand, flared with a hungry darkness. It didn't just expand, it ate the light in the chamber. The sensors screamed as the temperature dropped to absolute 0 in the test chamber. The steel walls groaned as the molecular bonds began to unravel. Then the scientists reactivated the field, but the containment unit buckled. The darkness lashed out, a tendril of nothingness striking the blast glass. The Emperor of the Kryllian recoiled, his fur standing on end, as a spiderweb crack appeared on the invulnerable transparent aluminum. "That is a grain of sand," Thorne said, his voice cold. "The artifact on Mars is holding back an ocean. If you want to study it, be my guest, but you break it, you buy the apocalypse." The demand for access was quietly withdrawn the next day. The political maneuvering settled into a grudging respect. The humans were crazy, yes, but they were the necessary kind of crazy. Meanwhile, the reconstruction of Earth was proceeding at a feverish pace. The Ethelgardian geoshapers, masters of planetary restoration, worked alongside human engineers to heal the scars of the bombardment. They reseeded the atmosphere, scrubbed the radiation from the soil, and rebuilt the cities. It was a time of unprecedented cooperation. Alien tech merged with human grit. Gravity manipulation cranes lifted skyscrapers into place. Bioengineered algae scrubbed the oceans clean. Cultural exchange flourished. Human music, raucous, emotional, chaotic, became a fad on the core worlds. Xylot martial arts were integrated into Marine Corps training. The galaxy was becoming smaller, tighter, knitted together by the scar tissue of the war. But the mystery of the artifact remained. As the years passed, the scientists working in the vault on Mars began to decipher the pulses it emitted. They weren't just a lock mechanism, they were data, a history. Dr. Aris Thorne, the Admiral's younger brother and the lead xenoarchaeologist, broke the code 3 years after the war. He requested an emergency meeting with the High Council, which now included human representatives as permanent members. The chamber on Titan was tense as Dr. Thorne activated the holographic projector. "We thought the nullity was the enemy," he began, his face pale, illuminated by the shifting blue light of the data stream. "We were wrong. The nullity was a preservative." "Explain," Vrax demanded, leaning forward. "The data in the artifact tells a story from before the formation of the stars we know," Dr. Thorne said. "There was a civilization, the precursors, we have no name for them. They spanned the universe. They were gods of physics, but they discovered something, a decay in the fabric of reality itself, a cosmic rot. The hunger that dreams isn't a monster, it's a flaw in the universe, a localized collapse of the laws of physics that spreads like a cancer." The hologram shifted, showing a simulation of the universe turning dark, not from invasion, but from simply ceasing to be. "The precursors couldn't stop it," Dr. Thorne continued. "So they built the nullity. It's a cauterizing agent. It burns away the infected tissue to save the whole. It was coming here because the Sol system is a localized infection point. The lock isn't holding a monster in. It's holding reality together. The artifact is a patch, a stellar-scale bandage on a wound in space-time." "So," Admiral Thorne said slowly, the realization dawning on him with horrifying clarity, "by fighting the nullity, by stopping the cauterization." "We stopped the surgery," Dr. Thorne finished. "We saved the patient from the scalpel, but the cancer is still there, and it's waking up." The silence that followed was different from the one in the war room years ago. That had been the silence of impending death. This was the silence of a burden so heavy it threatened to crush the soul. They had won the war, but they had doomed the galaxy to a slow, agonizing unraveling, unless they could do what the precursors couldn't. "Can we fix it?" Kravax asked, his voice unexpectedly soft. "Can we heal the wound?" Dr. Thorne looked at the alien warlord, then at his brother, then at the diverse assembly of species that filled the room. "The precursors were powerful," he said, "but they were singular. They were. One mind, one logic. They lacked variance. They lacked the chaotic, irrational, stubborn refusal to accept the impossible that I see in this room. The data suggests that the wound responds to consciousness. It feeds on despair, on acceptance of entropy. The precursors accepted their fate. They built the nullity because they gave up on fixing the flaw." He smiled, a tired but hopeful smile. "We don't give up. The artifact has instructions for a resonance weave, a way to stitch the fabric back together. But it requires the combined psychic and technological output of the entire galactic civilization. It requires the Xylot's focus, the Ethelgardian's precision, the Uli's empathy, and human stubbornness." Admiral Thorne stood up. He adjusted his uniform, wincing slightly at the ache in his old injuries. He looked out at the assembly, at the former enemies, the cowards turned allies, the refugees turned builders. "Well," he said, his voice steady, We held the line against the fire. Now we have to stitch the universe back together. We didn't run then. We aren't running now. He turned to Vrax. Counselor, mobilize the fleets, not for war, for engineering. We have a universe to fix. The cinematic sweep of the camera would pull back then, through the roof of the Titan base, up through the orange haze of the moon's atmosphere, past the orbital shipyards where human and alien ships were docked side by side, welding torches sparking in the dark. It would pull back further, past the ringed giant of Jupiter, past the red dot of Mars where the artifact pulsed with a new, rhythmic light, not of warning, but of a heartbeat. It would zoom out to the edge of the solar system, where the debris of the great battle still floated, now serving as the foundation for new stations, new habitats, new beacons. And finally, it would pan out to the galaxy itself, a swirling spiral of light against the dark. But in the center, where the fear had once been, there was a bright, defiant pulse, the signal of a united galaxy, the signal of the species that refused to run. The work began immediately, a project of a scale that made the Great Pyramids or the Dyson swarms look like child's play. They called it the Stitch. The plan was to create a lattice of psionic amplifiers and gravitational anchors around the Sol system, utilizing the Xylot's natural telepathic resonance amplified by Guardian crystal tech, all powered by human fusion reactors. The goal was to impose a new reality over the flaw, to literally will the universe into a stable state. It was dangerous. If the synchronization failed, the backlash would wipe out the minds of billions. But there was no dissent. The fear of the nullity had been replaced by a collective purpose. For the first time in history, the galaxy wasn't just a collection of borders and trade routes. It was a single organism fighting for its life. The day of the activation was marked by a stillness across the galaxy. On 1,000 worlds, beings paused in their work. In the great hives of the Uli, the fluid tanks were still. On the forge worlds of the Xylot, the hammers stopped ringing. All eyes, all sensors, all hopes were turned toward Sol. On the bridge of the Iron Will, now permanently docked to the Titan station as a command center, Admiral Thorne stood with his hand hovering over the activation key. Beside him was Vrax, Kravax, and the Uli matriarch. They were linked, not just by technology, but by neural shunts that connected their minds to the grid. They would be the conductors of the symphony. "Ready, gentlemen?" Thorne asked, his voice echoing in their minds. "Ready," Vrax replied, his thoughts clear and calm. "For the glory of the struggle," Kravax added. "For the future," the matriarch whispered. "Engage," Thorne said. He pressed the key. The universe did not explode, it sang. A wave of light, invisible to the eye but blinding to the soul, swept out from Sol. It passed through the ships, through the planets, through the bodies of the defenders. It was a sensation of absolute solidity, of things clicking into place. The ache in the fabric of reality, a subconscious dread that every living thing had felt since the dawn of time, suddenly vanished. The wound was closed. The flaw was healed. The monitors in the command center flashed green. The artifact on Mars went dormant, its job finished. The lock was no longer needed, for the door had been sealed. Thorne slumped against the console, sweat pouring down his face, the neural link disengaging. He felt drained, empty, but lighter than he had ever felt in his life. He looked at Vrax. The alien was trembling, his eyes glowing with a soft luminescence. "We did it," Vrax whispered. "We actually did it." "Not bad for a bunch of primitives," Thorne grinned, though his hands were shaking. The celebration that followed was the greatest the galaxy had ever seen. It lasted for a standard month. There were feasts, parades, and speeches, but amid the joy there was a solemn understanding. They had changed. They were no longer the scattered children of the stars. They were the architects. Years later, Admiral Thorne, retired and gray, sat on the porch of his home on a terraformed Mars, watching the sun set over a green valley that had once been red dust. He held a glass of synthetic whiskey in his hand. A shuttle descended from the sky, landing softly on the pad nearby. Out stepped Vrax, walking with a cane, his chitin faded with age. "High Counselor," Thorne nodded, not rising. "Just Vrax, old friend," the alien said, sitting in the chair beside him. "I thought I would visit. The anniversary is tomorrow." "I know," Thorne said, looking at the stars emerging in the twilight. "Hard to believe it's been 20 years. "The galaxy is peaceful," Vrax said. "Boring almost. The Kryllian are complaining about trade tariffs again." Thorne chuckled. "Good, let them complain. Better than running from the dark." Vrax was silent for a moment, looking at the human. "You know the archives?" The ones we unlocked from the artifact after the stitch. We found something else. Oh, Thorn raised an eyebrow. More doom. No, Vrax said softly. A message. From the precursors, it seems they didn't just leave the nullity. They left a prediction, a calculation. What did it say? It calculated the probability of a species arising that possessed the specific combination of aggression, empathy, and irrational hope required to activate the resonance weave, Vrax said. The probability was near zero. They called it the variable. And they left a title for that variable. Vrax turned to look at Thorn. In their language, it translates to the inheritors. Thorn looked at the glass in his hand, swirling the amber liquid. Inheritors, huh? Sounds like a lot of responsibility. It is, Vrax agreed. But I cannot think of anyone better suited for the job. You stood when we ran. You fixed what was broken. You taught us that survival is not enough. Thorn took a sip of his drink and looked up at the night sky, at the tapestry of stars that was now safe, stable, and waiting. We didn't do it to be inheritors, Vrax, Thorn said quietly. We just didn't want to move. I like this neighborhood. Vrax made a sound that was the Ethelgardian equivalent of a laugh. Yes, it is a good neighborhood. They sat in silence as the stars came out, two old warriors watching over a galaxy that was finally truly at peace. The fear was gone. The running was over. And humanity, the stubborn, foolish, magnificent species that refused to budge, stood guard in the night, ready for whatever came next. But for now, there was only the quiet hum of a universe that had been made whole, and the knowledge that as long as they stood their ground, the darkness would never return.